Greetings, friend. It's a great pleasure to be with you again. I look forward to these programs, and I hope you do in viewing them. I'm thankful that you'll talk to me sometimes when I'm out in public and you meet me and say, I know you from your TV show, and I make a new friend and a new visit. You know, I've got a bit of philosophy. There's two things I try to do every day. One of them is to make a new friend every day. The other is to learn something new every day. And I'm usually able to do that. I make a lot of friends by telephone. Some of my close friends I've never seen, but we're friends by telephone. Even if somebody gets the wrong number, I try to talk to them. And if I get the wrong number, I try to talk to them. And I've made some real valuable contacts that way. Last week, I left you sort of hanging, kind of like, you remember the old movie houses, how they'd run a serial, they called it. It's a story about the time the stagecoach is going to run over the bluff or outlaws about to triumph, where they'd cut it off. You'd come and pay a quarter next week. Oh, yes, I remember the days when you get in the theater for a quarter, and even less sometimes. I know people a little older than I am who said they could get in for a quarter and also have change enough left to buy popcorn and a drink to go with it. Well, those days probably never come again. I found an old Indian head penny the other day and made me think of the Cameo offering free admission, well, not exactly free, but admission if you could bring one Indian head penny to a special show. I bet some people raked around trying to find one. You know, some people fear we're going to run out of Bristol history. Well, no. And all the books I've written and all the shows I've made and all the radio programs I've had in history, I, for one, realize that I'm only scratching the surface. There's a lot more out there. If you see a big old dark walnut cabinet behind me, that's an old wardrobe is what it is, brought here from Chesapeake, Virginia. I put shelves in it, and that thing is full of notebooks of Bristol history, that most of which has not been used yet. Of course, I won't live to use it all, but I will try to dig into it and give you some of it all through the years, whatever time I've permitted to live. I've already used a lot, but not anyways near what's even stacked behind me here. And people also are giving it to me every day. I nearly always learn something about history every day. And I advise you, before I get into the gist of the story here, I advise you to try to make a new friend every day. You know, a lot of people grow old and their circle of friends grow tighter and tighter until maybe if they live to be 100, there's hardly anybody to go to the funeral. I knew a woman that was one of the best known women in town, lived to be 102 years old. And when she died, I hurried to the church, got there an hour ahead, thinking that the place would be so crowded that wouldn't be room to seat us all. But when I got there, and I sat for an hour waiting for the rest of the crowd, possibly 20 people showed up for the funeral. As you grow older, don't allow your circle of friends to get smaller. Make new friends every day. Now, last week I told you about Chief Smoking Basket. How in the world did a man get a name like that? Well, that's the rest of the story. I told you how that one morning kings were awakened by the screaming of the slaves. There's an Indian among us, there's an Indian out here. But he wasn't a savage, a kind old Indian chief. Well, they put him in the slave cabin, and he soon learned one of the other terrors of the slaves on the place. You see, in those early days, what we now know as the knobs, that's those hills between Volunteer Parkway and the road toward Bluntville, a wedge in between there. Steel Creek runs right through it, and there's a walking road at least through there that people walk and hike. But I've always wished there was a connecting road through there, but of course that has never been done. But mouth of the Steel Creek Park is at one end, and the Rooster Front is at the other end of the pass through the hills. And on the left, as you go through that pass, and to the right too, there are numerous knobs. They call it the knobs. They're mentioned on the earliest deeds of Bristol. And they're mentioned even before that. They're mentioned in 1750 by the surveyors that came through at the time. Well, you know those knobs, you can get lost in them real easy. It's a real wilderness that most people who live right against them don't know about. And today, those knobs are full of copperhead snakes. Some people call them pilot snakes. I don't know how they got that name. But people living on the extreme end of Windsor Avenue may find copperheads in their yard. I'm thankful I don't live out there. And on the other side of the hill, if you get right up against the knobs, you may find copperheads in your yard. One man told me he'd killed 27 in his yard, and he lives on Hill Street. They crawl down out of the hills behind him. But in the early days, now one thing you won't find in the knobs, and you won't hear any old timer who ever found one there, there's no rattlesnakes. Plenty of copperheads, they're dangerous, but no rattlesnakes. Now why, how come that? It's a big wilderness area, and you would think there'd be rattlesnakes there. No, if you want to see a rattlesnake, and I guess you do, you'll need to go to the Holston Mountain or the Clinch Mountains, and you can find plenty. But in the days when Colonel James King settled at the mouth of, just below the mouth of Steel Creek, there were rattlesnakes galore in those knobs. The slaves would find them in the fields, and you had to have a time of getting them to work again. They were scared to death of them. One morning, an old slave found one at the chicken house door, and he would not go back to the chicken house to work again, creating a real problem. And the Kings found one coiled in the chimney corner of the main house one morning. Big one, very large rattler. Colonel King riding his prized horse up Steel Creek one day. The horse was trying to get a bite of grass along the way and jerked his head back and sprang back, snorted. He had been bitten in the nose by a 5-foot rattlesnake. The horse almost died. Well, I told you they put old Chief smoking basket in one of the slave cabins. The next morning, he awoke to find a big rattler crawling in the open door of the slave cabin. He mentioned it to Colonel King, and Colonel King said, yes, we have a great problem with rattlers. They're crawling down out of the knobs here, they're everywhere. And the chief said, now this is part of the deal I told you last week about it. He wanted to share this knowledge of where there's a fortune buried on the place. Well, that I didn't mention then, I didn't want to give it away too quick. That was part of the deal. Chief Smoking Basket said, you be kind to me, and I will rid these knobs of rattlesnakes. I have a formula that was passed down to me. Now this takes on the air of a myth or a legend right here, but no lesser person than the renowned Reverend James King told it for the truth. He remembered it and vowed it was true as long as he lived. His family believed it because they knew that Papa King, they called him, would not tell a lie. But Chief Smoking Basket said, be kind to me, and I will rid these hills of rattlers. He spent several days digging roots. He skinned bark off of trees and even took the leaves off of some trees and worked for days weaving them together in a basket that looked like, they said the best they could describe it, it looked like a hornet's nest. Somehow he managed to set the interior of that basket afire. It began to put out a greenish-like smoke. It had a very, very bitter, very sharp air to it that if you breathed it, it'd just about knock you down. And it had an awful odor to it. Chief Smoking Basket said, "I'll be gone for 2 or 3 days." And he went up in those knobs. And he walked all over the mountains, all over the tops of the knobs, down the sides of the knobs. And his magic, what seemed to be near magic basket, was not consumed. But it still put out that awful puffs of smoke. And in the daytime, you could see the smoke rising up in the woods where he was walking around with that basket. Now you know how he got the name of Chief Smoking Basket. And finally, he came down out of the hills. But before he came down out of the hills, and the strange part was, he had walked night and day without food or sleep. And yet he did not seem to be hungry, or he did not seem to be sleepy. All of this told by the noted Reverend King, who was not prone to tell stories. It does, I admit, I'll be the first to admit, it sounds like a myth or a legend that people build up, but it was sworn to be the truth by Reverend King. All right, before he came down out of the hills, rattlesnakes by the dozen were crawling down and across the fields. One of the uncles by marriage of Reverend King killed numerous ones in his yard. He lived at the head of Quail Run. There's an old cemetery there that people don't know much about. It's a hidden, and somebody may have built a house over it. If they do, my Aunt Margaret would guarantee they'd have a ghost in the house, but that's another story. He was a fiddler, and he killed enough rattlers and saved their rattles to put in his fiddle till he filled his fiddle with them. He claimed it'd make it sound better. All over the flatlands, back into the knobs across Cedar Creek, and all out in Holston Valley. Rattlers by the dozen were found, crawling, going toward the river and the mountains. And at the King place, the slaves just about went crazy. They could find a snake anywhere they looked, really, a big rattler. Well, Reverend King made the statement in his old age, "I lived on the farm until I was a grown man, and then I owned it for several years after that. And I had lots of land back in the knobs, thousands of acres back there that my father, Colonel James King, had to support the ironworks. He just about denuded the hillsides down there with the trees to burn his furnace, make his iron furnace work." But King said to this day, when he was about 70 years old, "I have never seen or heard of another rattlesnake being in the knobs." They said the the awful smell of that smoke lingered for weeks. Hunters would try to go up in there, and their eyes would burn, their nose would burn, from the fumes or whatever it was that emitted from that basket in the form of smoke. Well, Chief said that secret was passed to me, and he wanted to pass it to some member of the King family, but it never worked out. However, one day, Reverend King became his companion, more or less. They'd walk together in the woods, hunt together, and so on. One day they were sitting up on the hillside, and the old Smoking Basket, somewhat of a psychic it seemed, said, "James, young James, you're going to marry pretty soon. And the day your first child is born, I will die." Well, Reverend King married in 1812. In 1813, just a little over a year from the time of his marriage, his first child was born, a daughter named Sara, who married a king and then finally married a hill and left a great progeny in this country. The day she died, the day she was born, Smoking Basket was found dead in his cabin. his prophecy came true. He's buried in what's now the Ordway Cemetery, but there's no marker to his grave. His memorial, we might say, lives on in a rattlesnake-free knob section of Bristol and in a cabin, of which I told you last week, that can be found the last time we had the show. That cabin can be seen now on the grounds of the Dairy Inn in Bluntwell, Tennessee. Now you know the story. Call it a myth if you will. One thing is certain. No one's ever found a rattlesnake in the knobs since Smoking Basket supposedly worked his charm and drove them all out to the mountains. Folks, good to be with you, and I wish you well, and may the best in life be yours until we meet again. And that'll be soon, I hope.